data on that are pretty clear. If you teach children to read using phonetics, which breaks it, we have a phonetic alphabet because that makes things easier. You only have to remember 26 characters and variants on them instead of 10,000, say. You teach the phonemes and you get them to aggregate them. And once they get to the point where they can read phrases, they start to read on their own account because it becomes rewarding. If you use other methods, they don't learn as well.
Good job. I would treat them decently, and they'd buy a house, and so on and so forth. So, but they had no idea how to encourage them.
Right, they have no idea what the micro elements are. No,
none whatever.
You see this in illiterate families too, is that if you ask them, do you want your children to be educated? They say yes, but there's no books in the house, and they don't know where to buy a book, and they're intimidated by books. And if they have a book, they don't know how to read it to their child. And you get these huge differences by the age of 3 between children in literate and non-literate households. The 3-year-olds in literate households might have been exposed to, 1,000 hours worth of books by the time they're 3. They can already sit in a house like that. You give them a book, they know what it is, they'll sit there and mime the action of reading. They go through the pages, they point at the pictures, they have all these pre-literate behaviors built in that's the necessary scaffold for the development of literacy. And there's micro habits that are invisible. If you're in that culture, they're invisible because they're just part of how you live, like the fact that you have a bookshelf, like the fact that your relatives buy your children books. If you don't know how to do that at all, the barriers to entry are unbelievably unforgiving.
Yes, and probably also nobody tries to make up for it on the behalf of the parents. So, the schools are themselves now doubt the value of literacy, some of them. The teachers don't know what they're supposed to be teaching, or at least, or alternatively, a lot of them are more interested in the ideological correctness of the children than they are in their ability to read.
Well, it's actually quite difficult to teach children to read. You have to pay attention to each child, and they radically differ in their intellectual ability. And then you actually have to know how to teach someone to read. And that's actually complicated. You start with the letters, you get the letters pronounced, you get 2-letter combinations and 3-letter combinations, you automatize that. It's effortful. Ideological indoctrination, that's relatively straightforward.
Yeah. Well, I can't really speak about this because I never tried to teach anybody to read. I had an interesting experience in
the data on that are pretty clear. If you teach children to read using phonetics, which breaks it, we have a phonetic alphabet because that makes things easier. You only have to remember 26 characters and variants on them instead of 10,000, say. You teach the phonemes and you get them to aggregate them. And once they get to the point where they can read phrases, they start to read on their own account because it becomes rewarding. If you use other methods, they don't learn as well. So,
one thing that I saw with my patient, I was interested in their level of education, which was catastrophically low. It was unbelievably low. And I would give them something to read, and you could see that they had difficulty doing it. I asked them to read it out loud. And then when they came to a long word, they would say, I don't know that word. I don't know that one, as if English were written in ideographs.
In Chinese, yes.
In Chinese.
Mandarin, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Some teachers teach an ideogram method of verbal apprehension, which is absolutely counterproductive. That's how experts read, but that's not how you learn to read.
Yes. No, and then I would say, when they got through it, I would ask them, what did it mean? And they would say, I don't know, I was only reading it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
As if...
Unless you can read phrases at a glance, you spend so much intellectual energy decoding the phonemes and the letters that you can't read for meaning. That's why it's not rewarding to begin with, right? You have to go through that slog of automatizing the subroutines, and that happens much more, much at a much earlier age in literate households.
Yeah. Well, I thought what I found very strange was that there was no sense of outrage that we spend on average $100,000, probably more, on each pupil's education. And about 20% of them come out functionally illiterate or barely literate, the kind of people that I'm talking about who couldn't read a phrase or who had difficulty sounding it out, and then at the end of it didn't know what it meant. Now, how is it possible to spend so much money and have these results? And this has a catastrophic effect on their lives. It's obvious that it must have, in any modern society, it must have a catastrophic effect on their lives. But nobody seemed to be interested or saw it as a disaster.
You'd think the faculties of education would be interested, and you'd think that by now they would have, say assessed an immense variety of methods to teach children how to read, let's say, because I think pretty much everybody could agree that that would be good. You know, that they would have tried out 200 different educational techniques, subjected them to stringent analysis, and that we would see an increase in the efficiency of teaching children to read that would be in keeping with the increase in technological power that we've seen over the last 20 years. We should be teaching kids to read at a rate that's just beyond comprehension if the faculties of education were doing their jobs, which they're not. Quite the contrary. So yes, and I was thinking too, you know, one of the things I found really interesting working with people who were dispossessed was, you know, you might think, well, you don't want to impose these external norms on them. There's a form of colonialism that would be associated with that, or classism or something like that. And I suppose that's part of the non-judgmental stance, but you can always just ask the people themselves. And what you find right away is they want for themselves pretty much what the middle class person or the upper class person has. And I don't just mean material resources. They'd rather be educated than not educated, or at least they'd want that for their children. They'd rather have a relationship, if they could figure out how to conceive of it, that was stable and loving. All of these things that, you know, you could regard as arbitrary. A child would rather have a father and a mother that were around. So we could derive norms for the direction of our social policies that could be derived from the populations that we're hypothetically trying to serve.